Stay with me on this one because what I'm about to walk you through isn't just another trade dispute or supply chain hiccup. This is something that's been building for decades, executed with a patience and precision that most Western governments still don't fully understand. And it's about to reshape the global economy in ways that will affect everything from your smartphone to your country's national security. China now controls 70% of the world's rare earth production. Not 30%, not half, 70%. And when you include processing and refining, that number jumps to nearly 90%. This isn't an accident. This isn't luck. This is the result of a deliberate multi-decade strategy that has quietly given Beijing a chokehold on the technologies that define modern civilization. Let me be absolutely clear about what rare earths actually are, because most people hear the term and assume we're talking about something obscure, something that only matters to scientists in laboratories. Nothing could be further from the truth. Rare earth elements are 17 metallic elements that are essential, and I mean essential in the most literal sense, to virtually every advanced technology on the planet. Your smartphone contains rare earths. Your laptop contains rare earths. Electric vehicles need them for their motors and batteries. Wind turbines can't function without them. Fighter jets, guided missiles, submarines, satellite systems, all of them depend on rare earth elements that overwhelmingly come from one country. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, praseodymium. These names might sound like something from a science fiction novel, but they're the reason your earbuds produce sound, the reason MRI machines can see inside your body, the reason modern weapons systems can lock onto targets with precision. Without these elements, the technological infrastructure of the 21st century simply doesn't exist. And China understood this decades before anyone else took it seriously. Here's the part that should genuinely alarm you. This didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping made a statement that has since become famous in strategic circles. He said, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." At the time, most Western analysts dismissed it as posturing. China was still a developing nation. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. America was the undisputed superpower. Why would anyone worry about some metals most people had never heard of? That dismissal was perhaps the greatest strategic miscalculation of the post-Cold War era. While the West was busy celebrating the end of history and the triumph of free markets, China was executing a methodical plan to dominate the entire rare earth supply chain. They started with mining. China has significant rare earth deposits, particularly in Inner Mongolia, but here's what most people don't realize. Rare earths aren't actually rare. They exist in deposits all over the world, including in the United States, Australia, Canada, and throughout Africa. The reason China dominates isn't geology. It's economics and strategy. Extracting and processing rare earths is environmentally devastating. It produces radioactive waste, toxic runoff, and requires massive amounts of chemicals and energy. Western nations, facing environmental regulations and public opposition, gradually abandoned their own rare earth operations. It was easier, cheaper, and politically convenient to let China handle the dirty work. And China was more than happy to oblige. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Chinese state-owned enterprises invested billions in rare earth mining and processing. They operated at a loss for years, deliberately keeping prices so low that no Western company could compete. Mines in California shut down. Australian operations went bankrupt. One by one, the alternative sources disappeared, and China's market share grew from dominant to near absolute. By 2010, they controlled 97% of global production. 97%. That's not market dominance. That's a monopoly achieved through patient, strategic economic warfare. Then came the moment that should have woken everyone up. In 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near disputed islands in the East China Sea. Japan detained the captain. China demanded his release. When Japan refused, China did something unprecedented. They cut off rare earth exports to Japan, one of the world's largest consumers of these materials. Overnight, Japanese manufacturers faced a choice between releasing the captain or watching their electronics and automotive industries grind to a halt. Japan released the captain. The message was unmistakable: control rare earths, control the leverage. The world noticed. Briefly, there were hearings in Congress, reports were written, concerns were expressed, and then, as so often happens, attention shifted elsewhere. The crisis passed, prices normalized, and China quietly continued consolidating its position, but now with an even more sophisticated approach. They moved beyond just mining and processing. They started acquiring rare earth deposits in other countries. Chinese companies bought stakes in mines throughout Africa. They invested in Australian operations. They secured access to deposits in Myanmar, Vietnam, and across Southeast Asia. Even when rare earths were being extracted outside China, Chinese companies increasingly controlled those operations. But the real strategic masterstroke was in processing. You can dig rare earth ore out of the ground anywhere, but turning that ore into the refined materials that actually go into technology requires specialized facilities, expertise, and infrastructure that China spent decades developing. Today, even if you mine rare earths in Australia or the United States, you almost certainly have to ship them to China for processing. The entire global supply chain runs through Chinese facilities. This is dependency at a level that makes oil politics look simple. At least with oil, there are multiple major producers. With rare earth processing, there's essentially one. Now let's talk about what's happening right now, because this isn't just history, this is accelerating. In recent months, China has begun implementing export restrictions on specific rare earth elements and the technologies used to process them. They're not cutting off supply entirely, at least not yet. They're tightening control, requiring export licenses, adding bureaucratic friction, and making it clear that access to these materials is not guaranteed. The timing of these restrictions is not coincidental. Look at what's happening in the global economy right now. The United States has imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods. Export controls on advanced semiconductors have cut off Chinese access to the most sophisticated chips. Washington is actively trying to slow China's technological advancement, and Beijing is responding with the most powerful lever it has. You want to restrict our access to chips? Fine. Let's see how you build those chips without the materials only we can provide. This is economic warfare, and rare earths are the ammunition. Consider what happened in early 2025. After the latest round of American tariffs, China announced export controls on 7 additional rare earth elements, specifically targeting materials essential for military applications and advanced electronics. Samarium for precision-guided weapons, gadolinium for nuclear reactors and medical imaging, erbium for fiber optic communications. These aren't random selections. These are surgical strikes aimed at the supply chains that matter most to American technological and military supremacy. And here's what makes this so dangerous. There are no quick alternatives. You cannot spin up a rare earth processing facility in months or even years. The Mountain Pass mine in California, America's only significant rare earth operation, sat idle for years and still sends much of its output to China for processing. Plans for new facilities face environmental reviews, permitting delays, and the fundamental problem that China can crash prices at any moment, making new investments financially ruinous. Any company considering entering this market knows that Beijing could flood the market with cheap rare earths the moment a competitor becomes viable, driving them into bankruptcy just as they did in the 1990s and 2000s. The Department of Defense has known about this vulnerability for years. Report after report has warned that American weapon systems depend on materials controlled by a strategic adversary. The F-35 fighter jet, the most advanced and expensive weapons program in human history, requires rare earths for its electronics, its targeting systems, its stealth capabilities. Every Tomahawk missile needs them. every submarine, every satellite. The entire American military apparatus runs on materials that China can restrict or cut off at will. This is not theoretical vulnerability. This is an existing condition that has no near-term solution. Let me put this in concrete terms. If China decided tomorrow to halt rare earth exports to the United States entirely, here's what would happen. Within weeks, production lines for electronics would begin shutting down. Not slowing, shutting down. Smartphones, laptops, tablets, everything that requires miniaturized electronics would face immediate component shortages. Electric vehicle production would halt. Not just Tesla, but every manufacturer working on electrification. The batteries, the motors, the power electronics all require rare earth materials that would suddenly become unavailable. The defense implications would be even more severe. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, every major defense contractor would face immediate supply chain disruptions. Production of new weapon systems would stop. Maintenance of existing systems would become increasingly difficult as spare parts dried up. Within months, military readiness would begin to degrade in ways that adversaries would certainly notice and potentially exploit. And it wouldn't just be America. The entire Western alliance depends on the same supply chains. European manufacturers, Japanese technology companies, South Korean semiconductor producers, they're all equally vulnerable. NATO's collective defense capability rests on a foundation of rare earth materials that flow overwhelmingly from Chinese sources. This is not a trade imbalance. This is a strategic dependency that would be considered unacceptable in any other domain. Think about how the United States and its allies responded to oil dependency in the 20th century. Entire foreign policies were structured around ensuring access to petroleum. Wars were fought, alliances were formed, massive strategic reserves were created. The entire architecture of American power in the Middle East was fundamentally about oil security. But at least with oil, there were alternatives. There were multiple major producers. There was OPEC, but also non-OPEC sources. There were strategic petroleum reserves that could buffer short-term disruptions. With rare earths, the situation is far more concentrated and far more dangerous. There is no OPEC of rare earth producers because there's essentially only one producer that matters. There are no strategic reserves worth mentioning because stockpiling these materials was never prioritized. There are no readily available substitutes because the unique magnetic and chemical properties of rare earth elements are precisely why they're essential. The United States and its allies sleepwalked into a dependency that makes oil vulnerability look manageable by comparison. Now, you might be thinking, surely we're doing something about this. Surely there are plans to diversify supply chains and reduce dependency. And yes, there are plans. There are always plans. The question is whether those plans can possibly move fast enough to matter. The Biden administration announced initiatives to boost domestic rare earth production. The Pentagon has funded pilot programs. Allies like Australia and Canada are exploring expanded mining operations. All of this is real, and all of it is happening far too slowly. Here's the fundamental problem. China spent 30 years building this dominance. They accepted environmental devastation. They operated at strategic losses. They made rare earth control a national priority at the highest levels of government. Reversing that in 5 years, or even 10, would require a mobilization of resources and political will that Western democracies have rarely demonstrated outside of major wars. Every new mine faces environmental impact assessments that take years. Every processing facility faces community opposition because nobody wants radioactive waste in their backyard. Every investment decision carries the risk that China will crash prices the moment the facility becomes operational. The numbers tell the story. In 2023, the United States produced approximately 43,000 metric tons of rare earth oxides. China produced approximately 210,000 metric tons, but production is almost irrelevant compared to processing. America has essentially one significant processing facility. China has dozens. representing decades of accumulated expertise and infrastructure. Closing that gap isn't a matter of writing checks. It's a matter of time that we may not have. Meanwhile, China continues to tighten its grip. Recent export controls don't just restrict raw materials. They restrict the technology used to process them. Even if another country wanted to build processing facilities, they would struggle to acquire the specialized equipment and expertise that China has monopolized. This is strategic encirclement executed over decades, and the walls are now closing in. The question everyone should be asking is simple. What does China intend to do with this leverage? Because you don't spend 30 years methodically building a monopoly over the materials essential to modern technology unless you have a plan to use it. And the answer is becoming clearer every day. This isn't just about trade negotiations or economic advantage. This is about fundamentally reshaping the global balance of power in ways that will affect every nation on Earth. Let's start with Taiwan. The island that produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors is also the most likely flashpoint for a major conflict between China and the United States. American security guarantees to Taiwan depend entirely on the credible threat of military intervention. But what happens to that threat when the weapon systems required for intervention depend on materials controlled by China? This is the strategic checkmate that Beijing has been patiently constructing. Every F-35 that can't be built because of rare earth restrictions is a fighter jet that won't be defending Taiwan. Every guided missile that can't be produced is one less threat to Chinese naval forces. Every submarine that can't be maintained is a gap in the Pacific defense perimeter. Military strategists call this anti-access area denial, the ability to prevent an adversary from projecting power into a contested region. China has invested heavily in missiles, ships, and aircraft designed to keep American forces at bay. But the rare earth monopoly represents something even more potent. It's the ability to degrade American military capability before a conflict even begins, not by sinking ships or shooting down planes, but by ensuring those ships and planes can never be built or maintained in the first place. And Taiwan is just the most obvious application. Consider the broader technological competition between China and the West. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced telecommunications, clean energy technology. All of these fields depend on rare earth elements. The nation that controls these materials has significant leverage over who can compete in the industries that will define the 21st century economy. China isn't just securing supply for itself. It's positioning itself as the gatekeeper for everyone else. This explains why Chinese companies have been so aggressive in acquiring rare earth assets around the world. It's not enough to control domestic production. The goal is to ensure that no alternative supply chain can emerge that doesn't somehow flow through Chinese interests. When a mining company in Africa discovers a significant rare earth deposit, Chinese investors arrive with capital and infrastructure promises before Western competitors even finish their feasibility studies. When processing technology is developed anywhere in the world, Chinese companies seek licensing agreements or outright acquisitions. This is systematic, patient, and relentless. The Democratic Republic of Congo offers a telling example. The country holds some of the world's largest deposits of cobalt and significant rare earth resources. Chinese companies now control approximately 80% of Congo's cobalt production through a combination of direct ownership and purchasing agreements. The infrastructure being built to extract these resources, the roads, the railways, the port facilities, is largely Chinese financed and Chinese built. When these materials leave Congo, they flow to Chinese processing facilities. The pattern repeats across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Anywhere significant deposits exist, Chinese capital follows. Western nations have begun to recognize this pattern, but recognition and effective response are very different things. The European Union has published critical raw materials strategies. Australia has tightened foreign investment rules around strategic minerals. The United States has invoked the Defense Production Act to support domestic projects. But these responses share a common problem. They're reactive, fragmented, and operating on timelines that don't match the urgency of the situation. So where does this end? What happens next in a world where one nation controls the materials essential to modern civilization? The honest answer is that we're entering unprecedented territory, and the range of possible outcomes spans from manageable adaptation to genuine catastrophe. The first trajectory is continued gradual tightening. China doesn't need to dramatically cut off rare earth exports to achieve its strategic objectives. It simply needs to make access increasingly conditional, increasingly uncertain, and increasingly expensive for countries that don't align with its interests. Export licenses that take months to approve, quality inspections that mysteriously delay shipments, processing capacity that's prioritized for domestic manufacturers and friendly nations while others wait. The second trajectory is strategic weaponization during a crisis. If tensions over Taiwan escalate, if a military confrontation appears imminent, China could use rare earth restrictions as a tool of coercive diplomacy. Intervene in Taiwan and watch your defense industry shut down. Watch your technology sector collapse. Watch your economy crater because you cannot produce the goods that modern life requires. The third trajectory is accelerated decoupling, accepting massive short-term costs in exchange for long-term independence. This would mean subsidizing domestic rare earth production regardless of market prices, accepting environmental consequences that current regulations prohibit, and treating rare earth security the way previous generations treated food security or energy security. Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't primarily a story about geology or economics. It's a story about strategic patience versus strategic negligence. China identified rare earths as a source of leverage 3 decades ago and systematically built dominance while the West focused elsewhere. The consequences of those choices are now arriving, not all at once, not dramatically enough to dominate headlines, but steadily, inexorably, in ways that will constrain Western technological and military options for decades to come. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening beyond the headlines, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to understand why the devices in their pocket and the security they take for granted depend on decisions made in Beijing. And in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. Do you think Western nations can break this dependency, or have we already passed the point of no return? Let me know what you think.